If you're struggling to land instructional design interviews, you can use AI tools to help you with your application materials. In this video, I'm going to show you how you can use ChatGPT to save yourself time when you start applying for ID jobs. You can use ChatGPT to help you reframe your resume and also practice for interviews. So take a look at this example here where I had ChatGPT generate interview questions for me and then personalize responses based on my former experience. We'll get into this more later in the video, but if you don't know me already, my name is Joanna Cappuccilli, and I'm an instructional designer at AWS and also a bootcamp pro in DevOps ID Bootcamp, where I've helped hundreds of people build strong application materials. I've been helping people in the bootcamp with their resumes for over a year now. And if you'd like to get that personalized support, feel free to join us in the bootcamp. But if you don't have access to the one-on-one coaching support, no worries. You can use AI to help you with that. Coming from teaching, I felt like it was really hard for me to identify my transferable skills at first and then translate those to the ID space, whether that was on my resume or creating interview responses or building a LinkedIn profile. It was just really overwhelming at first, and I didn't really know where to start. So I think that's where ChatGPT can come in and really do some of that heavy lifting for you and save you time in that process. Now, full disclosure, I didn't feel like ChatGPT was saving me time in the beginning because there was a lot of back and forth to kind of find the right prompts to get the output that I was looking for. I was finding that the output was not very consistent and not what I was looking for. So prompt engineering is going to be really key throughout this process, and refining those prompts to get them to a good place, to get you to a better starting point to actually save you time. So that's why Devlin and I spent quite a bit of time experimenting on what prompts would be good, for helping with your application materials, so that you can copy them and use them to get better output and to use them for your resume or for creating those interview responses. So if you want more detailed information on prompt engineering and how that works, you can check out Devlin's YouTube video, How to Use ChatGPT for ID. But just something to keep in mind here is that prompt engineering and just using ChatGPT in general really requires a human touch on both the front end and the back end. So, on the front end, really refining those prompts to get them to a better starting point, but then also refining them on the back end too with the output that you get and making it personalized and making it good quality. So let's take a look at an example of a prompt and how you can use it when creating your own. So in this first prompt, we're going to talk about how ChatGPT can take bullet points from a non-ID or, in this case, a teacher resume and revise them to a corporate ID resume. And I'll actually show you the output in ChatGPT after we break this down, but that's what we're looking at for this first prompt. So, just to kind of reiterate some of the limitations, it doesn't always give you the same output. So just keep that in mind. In this video, we are using ChatGPT 3.5, and we did find that the output was slightly different from ChatGPT 4.0. So if you want to pay for 4.0 to kind of get that enhanced output, you can. But the free version 3.5 still does a pretty good job, and it is more accessible. So something that we were finding too is that it wasn't maintaining the numbers every time. So I was, in the original prompt, I was asking it to keep the quantifications from my resume in the revised bullet points, but it wasn't doing that. So I'll get into kind of more what I did to resolve that and how that looked. And it didn't reframe every term. So that was a limitation. It did reframe some, but it wasn't reframing everything exactly to ID terms. And this was by no means a final draft. You'll want to use this as an initial draft. And, there was definitely some awkward wording. So that's just something to consider as you're doing this. And you may have to break up the prompt and input it as separate messages. So this was something that originally we were trying to do in a single prompt. And originally it didn't work when we first made it as a single prompt or, a single message. But then this is where, going back to it wasn't always giving the same output. We found that after trying that again, it actually wasn't working the same way. So, you have to kind of be patient with it and just, know that these are some of those limitations. But I found that by breaking up the prompt into several different inputs actually helped, but it was still nice to kind of take that time to work on a prompt first and then just, input that as separate messages into ChatGPT. So some prompt engineering tips. You'll want to, what we did for this example was we first started by telling ChatGPT its role, and this is always a good practice in general. But um, in this case, it was acting as a resume coach. So I said, you're a resume coach who specializes in helping educators land corporate instructional design roles. So very clearly telling it what its role is and what it's going to be, what its job is. You want to be specific. So be specific about what you're going to give ChatGPT and how you need it to help you. So in this case, I said, I'm going to give you a list of responsibilities that I performed on the job in numbered format. So very clear, so then it knows it's getting a list and then it's going to be in a numbered format. So being clear about what that format is. And then tying in how I needed to help me and being more specific, saying it's your job to generate revised responsibilities from my original responsibilities to make them better suited for a corporate instructional design job. Then giving it some parameters. So being specific about those parameters and then also including examples. And for this, I said, ensure that the revised responsibilities are no longer than 20 words and maintain the numbers where it makes sense to do so. So this is that example where in the original prompt, I was, in that first message, I was telling it to keep the numbers, but it actually wasn't. And so again, we'll get into how you can resolve it. But at least letting it know that that's what you wanted to do. It was also, at first when I was experimenting with this, it was also where it wasn't capturing the main idea of my original responsibilities. So it was completely changing the meaning and not just reframing certain terms like I wanted it to do. So I said, I added this to the prompt to say, don't lose the main idea and the original responsibilities either. And then I was specific about the output. So I described the output that I wanted. I said, please show your output in a table format, comparing the original responsibilities to the revised responsibilities. And after some experimentation, I found that this was a nice format to have it in because I compared them more clearly so I could see exactly how it was reframing certain terms. And same thing. It was also, it was changing the original responsibilities as well as the revised ones, but I wanted it to just change, just produce different revised responsibilities. So I made that clear. I said, do not change the original responsibilities, only change the revised ones. Because it was kind of unclear about, it was changing those original responsibilities and then also then changing those to revised ones, which it wasn't working in the way that I wanted it to. So this helped clarify that the type of output that I wanted. In the second message, this was now I decided to input this as an additional message where I asked it, where I was giving it more specific parameters and including examples. Where I said, do not include jargon from education or teaching, and then, giving it specific words to avoid, like lessons, students, classes, teaching. And then I found that it was important to be clear about where I wanted that to happen. So I said, don't include that in the revised responsibilities specifically. And then this actually we found was a big game changer in getting better output. So we said, ensure that you're branding me as a corporate instructional designer. And you could do this by including words and phrases commonly found on corporate instructional design job listings. So giving it that reference point made a really big difference in the output that it was giving. And then this was the third input that I gave in for this prompt. Um, as I said, it needed a reminder about maintaining the numbers or maintaining the quantifications from the original responsibilities. So I said, try again, keep the quantifications, and then gave an example of the quantifications that were in the original responsibilities, which is 350 plus and 30 plus, and then telling it to keep that in the revised responsibilities. So you can see, you might have to give it some reminders. You might have to input it in separate messages and just be really specific about where you want it to do certain things. So let's take a look at what that looks like in ChatGPT. So you can see this was some of the experimentation that I did with this, where I was kind of going back and forth with figuring out how to get the output that I wanted. I asked it to reframe my bullet points. And then I was also trying to kind of like teach it about what terms I wanted it to look for, as an instructional designer, learning experience designer, or, kind of those ID terms that I was looking to get from it. But you could see it was a lot of back and forth, and it just wasn't giving me what I was looking for. So after experimenting and revising and applying those tips that we just went through, this was the final output that I got that was actually pretty good. So I'm telling it its role, telling it what I'm going to give it, giving it specific parameters about, just, no longer than 20 words, and telling it not to lose the main idea, and then telling it the output that I wanted it in. And then also listing those responsibilities. And, you want to keep in mind here that I said I was giving it in a numbered format. So I'm going to make sure that I do that here and list it in a numbered format. So this was the output that it gave me. It, did a good job and following the instructions and putting it in that format, in that table format. But I found that I needed to then input a second message to tell it exactly what to do and not to include jargon from education or teaching, and then telling it that it could reference job postings to help brand me as an instructional designer. And once I did that, it was a lot better. So you can see it's starting to use words like learning solutions or diverse audiences in place of students, which is great. It was saying things like multimedia content in place of these materials. So that was also really great too. Saying things like instructional resources. But you can see this is where I was talking about how it's losing the numbers or the quantification in the revised responsibility. So this is where I gave it a third message, and I said, try again, keep the quantifications, and then said exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to keep these numbers in the revised responsibilities. So once I did that, it was pretty good. So it was still keeping words like learning solutions, and this time it actually said 350 plus individuals in place of students, which it was it was great because it was reframing that educational jargon. And this time, this example, it actually didn't. It lost multimedia content in this bullet point here. So that's where you want to, this is where that human touch is really important, because you may need to kind of analyze the output that you're getting and then revise it or combine it accordingly, and make sure that you're editing it and putting your personal touch on it. And again, just to reiterate, not treating these as a final draft, but just as like an idea to see how you could revise certain things. So yeah, overall, it did a pretty good job, and it was at least a good starting point to work with. All right, now we're going to look at another prompt that you can use for interview practice. But just want to call out here first that we know, even though we are providing you with prompts that you can use as a good starting point, that prompt engineering for each use case can be really time consuming. So that's why Devlin's working on an AI tool working on prompts to kind of, take some of that front end work off your hands. And if you're interested in that tool, you can join the waitlist at devlin.ai. But let's get into it. Let's look at the second prompt that we can use. So again, we're gonna be asking ChatGPT this time to generate common ID interview questions, and then based on those questions, provide then provide responses to those interview questions based on a list of your former experience. Um, so again, some limitations. Similar to before, you may have to input multiple messages for ChatGPT to understand the request. I found that I had to do that for this prompt. Again, it's not reframing every term, and it's again not a final draft. So just to keep those limitations in mind. And now let's take a look at what that looks like in ChatGPT. So first you can see kind of some of the experimentation that I did here, where I was going back and forth. Um, just in the first experimentation, it was actually providing a list of questions based on my former experience. So it wasn't giving me common ID interview questions. And so I was needed to keep that in mind in the final prompt. So this wasn't what I was looking for, but it kind of helped guide what we have here in this final prompt. So I found that splitting it up first was helpful. And by doing that, I first start by telling it, similar to the tips from the first prompt. These same tips are going to apply here, where you're telling it what its job or what its role is, and I'm telling it it's an interview coach who specializes in helping educators land corporate instructional design jobs, and then telling it that I needed to generate common interview questions asked in a corporate instructional design interview. So this time it did that. It actually generated some really good questions, like, can you describe your background in ID? How do you approach the ID process? Can you walk us through those steps? It's asking questions about subject matter experts. How do you create training that aligns with the learning objectives and meets the needs of your target audience? So these were really great questions to practice with. So now from there, I wanted it to take a list of my former experience and then provide responses to those interview questions that were a bit more personalized, at least as a starting point that I could work with to refine those responses. So I asked it to help me create a personalized, a list of personalized responses for these questions. And then I said, to do this, I will provide you with a list of my former experience. And then wanted it to, this is where I'm giving it parameters. So I wanted the responses to sound somewhat conversational and follow the STAR format, which, if you're not familiar with, is a common interview response method for situation, task, action, and result. And so I wanted it to list it like that, list my responses like that. And then gave it more parameters and said, do not include jargon from education or teaching, and then gave specific examples about what that was. And then describing the output, where I wanted it to be in a numbered list format, and again, listed in STAR format. Then provided it with a list of my former experience, and this is what it gave me. So this time it understood that just the response should change based on the former experience, and then it would still keep the common ID interview question. So it's breaking it down into each subsection of STAR, which is helpful, is because a lot of times when you're working with STAR, it can be helpful just to kind of have an idea of how you want to divide that experience up. So it's the situation was managing the caseload of students and what I would focus on, and then what the task was, how you did that. You collaborate with the departments to do that. The action was delivering these seminars to actually make that happen, and then the result was that there was reported increased engagement. So you can see that it's understanding how to break it down, and it can give you a good idea on how you can do that for your own experiences to different questions. Now you can tell, though, it's not actually reframing it in the way that it should be. So this is where I gave it another message, and I said, try again. Please avoid educational jargon as mentioned in my previous prompt. So don't be afraid to talk to it. like a human, and letting it know that you did already mention this in your prompt prior, and you wanted to as a reminder to do that. Um, and this is where I also told it, as before, to reference terms commonly found on instructional design job postings. So this was a lot better. You could see in saying, instead of saying students, it's saying individuals again. Um, it's saying, audience, meeting the needs of our audience. Words like learner engagement. So yeah, starting to use words like learners instead of students, which is great. Um, so yeah, overall you can see that you might have to give it a couple different reminders, but as long as you're following those kind of the basic structure of prompt writing, it can give you a good starting point to work with. So now that you know how to reframe your resume and practice for interviews with ChatGPT, let's get into some additional uses. You could try using it for your about section on LinkedIn. When I tried this, I gave ChatGPT my resume and my portfolio to kind of teach it about who I am, and teach it about my background, so that it could generate a profile, or at least a first iteration of a profile that I can use for my about section on LinkedIn. Um, you could also try using it for a first draft of a cover letter, where again, you're giving it your resume, maybe giving it a job description to kind of let it know what you need the cover letter for, and then asking it to generate a first draft. You could also use it to continue practicing um, for an interview. You could kind of do a role play situation here, where you ask ChatGPT to ask you an interview question, and then you respond to that question, and then ask it to evaluate your response to see how effective it was, or if there is a way that you could keep improving it. You could also provide it with specific job titles, or just specific job descriptions, and ask it to identify resume bullet points based on that. So this would come in handy when you're trying to tailor your resume for specific jobs. If you already have that general ID based resume and you just want to take it up a notch. So some considerations. Just want to reiterate again that prompt engineering really is key. You'll want to revise those prompts as much as you need to, just to get them to the place that you're trying to get them to, and get the output that you're looking for. And you may not get the same output every time with the same response. So just keep an open mind, and know that you'll have to really um, have good solid prompts to get the output that you're looking for. Be aware of the risks. There are risks when using ChatGPT. Hiring managers are throwing out resumes or application materials that seem fully generated by ChatGPT, or might look too identical to other resumes. Because sometimes ChatGPT can give similar output for multiple people. So that's why it's really important to just be smart about it. You'll want to think of ChatGPT as an assistant to sort of help you generate ideas, or help you with research, or produce first drafts or first iterations more quickly. Um, and not as a final draft. And it's just really, really important to add human touch. On the front end when you're creating those prompts, but also on the back end with that output. You'll just want to make sure that you edit it so it's good quality, and that you're personalizing it based on your own experience. We're seeing these AI tools become a part of the ID space more and more. So the reality is that it's important for you to know how to use these to be more productive on the job. And if you get experience working with these tools beforehand on your application materials, you'll be able to confidently talk about your familiarity with them during those interviews. And with the right prompts, you'll be able to save a lot of time and get first drafts much more quickly. So don't forget to join the waitlist for the AI tool at devlin.ai waitlist, linked in the description below. Give these tips a try. Let us know how it goes, and we'll see you in the next video.